Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Westworld from 1973. Now, Westworld has been in media news and on the mind of people for the last few years because of the television series by that name. Which was, I don't even want to say adapted from this movie. It was deeply influenced by and inspired by. I'm not going to spend a whole episode or really any amount of time talking about Westworld other than just the TV series, other than to say I think it's got a lot of good things going for it. It falls apart substantially and with some readiness. So I think there's a lot of good things about it, but it's just kind of not great ultimately. But even before that show was announced and I watched it, I had been meaning to watch this movie for quite a long time. It is generally recognized in sort of niche science fiction circles as being an important film or a sort of a cult classic of sorts. Not a really great one, but one that's worth watching. So I guess we'll just leap right into it and I'll say I think that this movie is deeply boring. It is not very good, does not have a lot of redeeming qualities. I do not understand a lot of the love for it, either contemporary or modern. There are some elements of it that I think are meaningful and interesting, but on the whole, it's lacking in a lot of value. So, I want to talk first about a connection between this film and Magnificent Seven. It may not be entirely clear, or it may be pretty clear because the silhouette is notable from the cover here that Yul Brynner plays the main antagonist in the film. That's him on the cover, assuming I got that same poster up on the video. He plays the main antagonist, and by all accounts, he's basically playing his character sort of kind of from Magnificent Seven. They dressed him the same. It's still Yul Brynner. They basically just said, here, do your character, but different. This is written and directed by Michael Crichton. Obviously, he's a big name now, but at the time, this was his, not his writing debut, but his directorial debut. And he was certainly not as well known as he is now for his writing. Allegedly, the movie had a budget of $1.2 million in 1970s, so, more, but still not a huge amount. And apparently there was some budget snafus that went on. So with that in mind, I have to keep that in mind, but this movie is still not very good. And I've actually never read any of Michael Crichton's books, just never felt particularly compelled to. I've heard from some people who like them and some people who don't. I am not going to pass judgment here because I don't think it's even particularly relevant. This was not a novel before it was a movie. He wrote the screenplay for it to be directed, and then I guess the screenplay was published after the fact. Anyway, I can't possibly see how that would be an interesting screenplay to buy and read unless there is something drastically expanding the content in the published screenplay, because this film is just almost without content. I'm going to go ahead and right now spoil basically the whole thing, because I don't think there's anything really to spoil, especially if you've watched or really had any knowledge of the Westworld TV show, the recent Westworld TV show. The plot of the film, of this entire film, is basically uh, guys go to Westworld. The robots go crazy and they kill a bunch of people. That's literally it. And at the end, surprise, surprise, they defeat the robot. It, there's nothing here. It's baffling. That's not to say that there's nothing valuable here. It's just not an interesting or compelling film to watch. Initially, I thought it was going to be something much better, and I thought that there was a lot more connection to the what I saw in the TV show, that I assumed was, being drawn upon more. But the further I got through this film, the more I saw that the TV show is almost unrelated, except for the most basic element of the premise. At the beginning, especially the very first scene of the film is an advertisement for Westworld, and there's the distinct feeling that you get from that there was a deliberate intention to have a commentary about sort of the 1970s yuppies and nouveau riche kind of accelerating consumerism, and this sort of semi-antiquated but still meaningful devolution of cultural consumption into sort of conspicuous consumption and amorality, for want of a better phrase. You get that sort of sense in the first couple of scenes, and then it basically disappears. There's hints of it, but it never feels like the movie is deliberately trying to say anything. It mostly feels incidental. That's not to say that I want the movie to be preachy, but especially when I'm gonna have to inevitably gonna draw these comparisons to the TV show, comparing it to the TV show, where so much of the TV show's overall arc is about unpacking the social ramifications, and both external to the individual and internal to the mentality of somebody who would go to a place like this. This movie has none of that, basically, aside from those initial hints, and it's just I don't know. It seems like it should be there. It seems like the hints are there, and then it just does nothing. Basically, by the second half of the film, the entire thing just devolves into a cheap, slasher horror movie, because it's just Yul Brynner chasing Richard Benjamin through the now semi-abandoned worlds, and that's it. There's just nothing else there. It's a survival thing, and it's not interesting either. It's not interestingly shot. There's no dialogue back and forth. He never really does anything interesting or clever. It's just not in any way compelling. I'm not rooting for I'm not rooting for any character, because they are non people. They're non-characters. They have no stakes. I'm not invested in them at all. The ramifications feel false. They don't. There's no weight to this thing other than the context of the film itself. The feeling, the like distinct feeling of you are watching film and should be and should be compelled by this. Therefore, you will be compelled, which it just isn't. For the most part, the cheapness of it is not like really obvious, but it's not hidden either. The sets are pretty limited. The number of actors and extras is pretty limited. The number of the number of extras, like everything looks a little bit bare. Some interior shots look pretty good, but a lot of stuff just doesn't even look like they quite finished the sets. Really, like I'm really kind of confused what they're going for with this whole thing. It's just not that interesting. That said, in a meta sense, it is interesting to me in where it sits in terms of science fiction and also real world technology. So I'm going to sort of digress for the rest of this video because there's some interesting things here that I think are worth talking about, and maybe the only redeeming quality I find personally with the film. Well, that's not true. Yul Brynner is fine. He's I quite like Yul Brynner. I think I made that pretty clear in the Magnificent Seven review, but our video, not review. Yul Brynner is great, and he does his best with what he has here, but it's still kind of not great. What is interesting is where this fits in terms of science fiction. So I'm a big fan of science fiction in general, especially the sort of eras between I'm going to say like sort of the 30s to the 60s or 70s, sort of the golden age up through the like post golden age science fiction. I think science fiction is a greatly misunderstood genre. I think I've talked about it before in another one of these videos, although I can't remember too much. I know I've talked about horror as well in a similar sort of context. But in terms of like a literary structure and a literary intent in terms of themes of exploration and sort of what that genre is looking at. This does fit into an interesting place in the science fiction realm, especially in a contemporary context. Obviously, this 73 is still sort of the early days of computing, modern computing, I'll say. What's sort of brought me to this comparison that I wanted to make is that there's a whole bunch of sets in this film that have backdrops full of contemporary servers, these being reel-to-reel tape computers. And that's really weird, not only because it's just they're fake. At least what I could see looked pretty like it was all for sets, but also because of what it's implying about the technology of the time. Now, the everything that they're showing is sort of in keeping with the modern technology in 1973. They don't, like, aside from the like major technological conceits specific to the park. Well, no, I mean, I guess at the beginning there is like a futuristic like hovercraft thing. It's weird. And that's part of what sort of brought this whole thing to my mind and is confusing me further about it. Is it feels like it's the far kind of ish future Oh, I actually have this up in front of me. Allegedly, it's supposed to be set in 1983, 10 years later. So, that's wild. That does not add any data. It's just a totally random point, I guess. Anyway, it's still got these tape reel servers, but the whole structure of this, I guess not that futuristic resort, is that they've got like robotic facsimiles of humans that are so realistic that you can't tell them apart. But the computing that they're using in the background is still reel to reel. And while obviously there is lots of non-direct, like non-computer computing technology, like lots of analog circuitry has been going on for, you know, decades and decades prior to this. The idea that they'd still be using, reels to handle computing, but that they would also in the exact same time and place have these advanced robots that are not only can do any computing at all in a mobile fashion running off a battery, but also that they'd be so advanced as to convincingly replicate humans, is sort of bizarre and hilarious. It's very much the sort of thing that you would think would lend the setting to be in a far-flung future of some kind, rather than a somewhat contemporary one. So it sort of comes to a question for me of like, whose fault is that? Is that Crichton's fault? Ultimately it is. He's the writer and director, so it is. But the question is that a matter of he didn't really consider what the ramifications were of setting it in a particular time and place, or didn't want to try and conceive of what future technology would look like sufficiently to sort of imagine what a future computing center would look like, and those sorts of things. I mean, like, they open up the robots on occasion and you see inside them, and they're basically just a whole bunch of basic it's a bunch of capacitors and resistors and things on analog boards. They're not like particularly complex, but it's still, there's this juxtaposition that just continues to not work for me at all, but is interesting in the context of science fiction as a genre, because it's not, it's sort of ignoring a lot of the typical writing conceits that go into either far-flung future or contemporary science fiction, where it may not, a lot of that science fiction does not necessarily explain everything that it's telling you, and expects some suspension of disbelief to no small extent, but still tries to paint a picture of how and why the developments exist. In this case, it really feels like a bunch of bizarre future technology was dropped out of the sky, and then some guys moved in some 1973 computers to run it all. It's very strange, and it really doesn't work for me at all. One other technical notable thing that I think is interesting about this film in a science fiction context is just that it is one of the, I think, earliest. It took me by surprise a little bit. I think this is one of probably a pretty early reference to the idea of a computer virus, and to it's not unique in terms of referring to like a self-replicating AI or something like that, but it is at least a somewhat unique instance in terms of like the specific context. So obviously, in modern, computing parlance, everyone is familiar with the idea of a computer virus. Um, but so the movie makes reference to the idea of there being a a virus or disease in the robots that is spreading between them, and the scientists that are discussing it sort of dismiss it out of hand. And at the time this film was made, that was probably seemed like a very silly kind of thing to say, with no idea of like the networked computing future or those sorts of things. For the most part, computing for a very long time was about writing a piece of code and then submitting it literally by, either giving it punch cards or a reel or something like that, like directly handing over the data to the computer to do the math and give you results, right? And so the idea of even like programs as we conceive of them now, or certainly a desktop environment, or even a direct responsive interface, was somewhat in the future. And certainly the idea of a virus that could spread between computers was sort of beyond comprehension. Obviously, you could think about the connection between telecommunications and computers and assume that that was going to happen at some point, but it wasn't really a thing. And certainly the idea of a malicious piece of code, while not entirely foreign, was sort of a bizarre idea that nobody could conceive of why that would really exist. Obviously, there's also some other stuff in science fiction history long before this, talking about the idea of AI and self-replicating, self-learning programs, all these other things that are certainly more in the minds of people in, IT development these days, but certainly at the time were fantasy. But the idea that there could be it's interesting because they never explain in the context of the film where this glitch comes from, whether it's a deliberate, like, learned reprogramming by the robots, or whether somebody else submitted it or something like that. There's never really any direct implication that the robots have any capability to learn. In fact, they show a lot of behind the scenes to pretty strongly suggest that the whole thing is just really elaborately staged, and they're basically not remote controlled, but like everything is really elaborately staged from behind the scenes by humans, and then the robots just execute what they were pre-programmed to do. So obviously the unpacking of the ideas of AI, free will, and a potentially like a virus that is, or a virus or a program that is developed internally rather than submitted externally, is somewhat unique and interesting in terms of how it compares at the time the film was made versus now. It doesn't go very far with it, so I don't know if I can give it a lot of credit for that, but I do think it is an interesting note in terms of thinking about it in a science fiction media context. The other part I wanted to talk about a little bit that does sort of is one of the few redeeming qualities is some of the effects are actually quite interesting and good, specifically for 1973. I will say that some of my complaints are certainly due to this not aging well. But that I don't allow that as an excuse, because I think most things in cinema in particular, we can tell even when they come out that they're not, whether or not they're going to age well. There's plenty of movies that are this age or older that have effects that age incredibly well. I think most of the like cinematic tricks even used in something like Metropolis age incredibly well. They're a little bit unusual, but they still work. But there's some bizarre stuff in here that really doesn't. That said, the digital processing, which, as I understand it, was like wholly new for the time, and I think this is the first film that ever used it. The processing that was done on the like I was resisting the urge to say it, but I'm going to say it. Terminator vision that Yul Brynner's gunslinger has is a really interesting visualization. However, it is very limited in its use and scope. And when it is juxtaposed against weird visuals like those tape reel servers or the small CRT displays that are just displaying random geometric patterns, as if somebody had programmed something fun into an oscilloscope and then forgotten to turn it off. It really dampens the interesting parts of all that. The one other effect that I think is done pretty well, and it's a mixed bag itself, is some of the what's the word I'm looking for? Some of some of the real props they use, and some of the models, the practical effects. That's what I was going to say. Are actually done really well, especially around the robots themselves. There's a couple of shots. This one's a mixed bag. There's some shots of like them opening up the robots with varying levels of convincingness. There are some that are just sort of simple depth of field camera tricks to make it look as though they're like opening up some inside an actual moving person, which are pretty well executed. There's one shot in particular of them taking off Yul Brynner's character's face, which is done completely practically, which they just made a really accurate model of his head and face, and they literally just disassemble a fake version of his head, but it is extremely well done. It was extremely well made. It's a incredible credit to the prop makers who made that prop. It looks fantastic and really sells the whole idea of this world more than anything else in the film, I would say, is this one practical prop. So I really appreciated that, in addition to this sort of unique digital effect that they did. That said, I don't think this is that valuable a film or an interesting film, or even particularly worthwhile for anybody but perhaps the most diehard of science fiction cinema fans. I'm not going to say it's without value, but it's a very boring watch, even at a mere 88 minutes. It is paced poorly, acted kind of mediocrely, written pretty badly, plotted badly. It wastes. It's 88 minutes and it wastes a lot of time. Which is just kind of baffling that they couldn't find anything to fill their time with that was more meaningful. There's just not a lot here. But I don't know. There's something for someone, I guess. Um. Anyway, I thought I had another thought, but if it was there, I've lost it. Um. Interesting, but I don't think I can recommend this to anyone. Anyway, yeah, I guess it was worth a watch for me just to sort of unpack it as a piece of media in a contemporary context. Anyway, without further ado, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.